So in brief, and I don't want to take too much more of your
Mhm.
time. We organized this last time. It's in the video, but I wanted to go back to this. The section of the Sunnan. We organized it in such a way that we can make sense of it because the natural organization in the book, it doesn't read properly as far as our logic of knowing the order of the salah. It doesn't flow the same way that the section of the obligations flows. So from the Sunan of the salah is the iqamah. Some of the scholars they emphasize it and they bring in the whole concept of um that the individual should do it and they do so uh given the priority that it has in terms of being connected with the salah and aiding in the establishment of the salah and aiding in the establishment of the salah. So you find that is emphasized extremely in a lot of the text. Here is listed as sunnah, but it does have a high priority, right? So just because we read sunnah, meaning that it's not an obligation, doesn't mean that it doesn't have high priority. And this is one of the reasons why it's not categorized as a fadila, right? Which is a kind of a less emphasized sunnah, so to speak. Fadila is somewhat of a less emphasized sunnah practice. So there's some practices of the sunnah that fall under obligation, and then some are called like sunnan uh, to emphasize that they've been practiced with frequency, but not to the level of obligation. And then you have the idea of fadila or mandub, or that which is encouraged, which shows that it's practice, but not at the same level of sunnah or not at the same level of wajib. Which wajib or fard, it means that it has to be done consistently. Sunan have a level of consistency, but a level of flexibility as well, meaning that they should be considered in the practice and should be adhered to. But if someone were to leave it out, uh, that there is no punishment that follows up with that, but reward. And so there's a level of flexibility there. In any event, the iqama is a practice which we should get into the habit of doing. But if it is the case that we don't do it, there's no harm in that, inshallah, as long as the intention is not a rejection of the sunnah and so on and so forth. And it's just a reminder. You know what I'm saying? It's a reminder. The adhan, I'm with the opinion of what is in Al Habib Tahir, which is from Shar Saghir and other books, that book Fiqh al-Islami, Fiqh al-Maliki, I'm sorry, Fiqh al-Maliki and his evidences, wa adillatuhu, Fiqh al-Maliki wa adillatuhu, or Maliki Fiqh and his evidences, that the adhan doesn't take one ruling, contrary to what isn't popular in the fiqh books, but the adhan can be any of the five rulings, and and that is a more workable position in terms of its implementation and its practice, and so on and so forth. Just having one ruling on that creates an issue. But the iqama overall, it's a sunnah. The minimal, probably, you can just speak to yourself in the tone that you can hear. And we mentioned this before in the last session. You may be at work or something like that. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to recite it out loud to the extent where the building next to you can hear, or the offices, or, you don't have to shout it. You know what I'm saying? And what is considered audible is that what you can hear. You know what I'm saying?
Sheikh,
You
I
have to.
seek permission to go. I got to go record the Adhan here, okay?
Okay, inshallah. So that's the
Assalamu
reality.
alaikum.
The sutra, the same thing. May Allah accept, make dua for us, inshallah. The sutra uh, is also something, and we mentioned as far as practicing the sutra, is something that we should get into the habit of doing. But the question is, how is that done? Well, again, you can be discreet about it. You can be behind the chair. You can be behind the pillar. You can put something between yourself and whoever else, or you can just pray close to a wall. You know what I'm saying? It doesn't necessarily have to be the case that it's notable, but in the way that sutra is presented here, is presented, as an object, and so the least of it is described by the description that is, um, by the description which characterizes, a lance, right? Right. That the least of thickness should be like a lance, right? And here it says that the least it should be in length is an arm's length. Right? So that's an ijtihad, so to speak. الأمر فيه واسع. That issue, there's flexibility in it. Something that is a recognizable barrier between yourself and anyone that would stand in your way is what's important. Is what's important. Don't get caught up 100% that it has to be this size and that size and this and that. But something that creates a barrier between yourself and anyone coming between you and the Qibla, uh, is the way, right? And the important lesson here is that the sutra of the Imam is sufficient for anyone else behind the Imam, right? Uh, and of course, the rule of cleanliness and the rule that is uh, firmly fixed so that there's no confusion with regard to it, is clearly stated here, right? But here, the sutra for other than the one following the imam, meaning by that the one praying alone, and the imam when it is feared that someone may pass in front of them, is sunnah, right? The least that it should be in thickness is the thickness of a lance, and the least it should be in length is an arm's length. It should be clean and firmly fixed without being a cause of confusion for those praying. Right. And we mentioned some things that can be taken as a sutra in our environment that are already fixed, that are in many of the locations that we pray in. You know what I'm saying? And be cautious not to walk in front of people while they're praying. Is their right, that we consider that, right? Versus being negligent and unconscious and unempathetic to people while they're making salah. And may Allah grant us the intention of revering and honoring the salah and thinking about these types of things. But that's important. And so then we move to the takbir. We mentioned this many times that the first takbir, and when we talk about takbir, we're talking about the saying of the takbir, Allahu Akbar, right? There's debates among the ulama in the madhab with regard to whether other than Allahu Akbar is sufficient for the opening up of the salah. And pretty much the minimum will be Allah. But there's the opinion that is not valid without saying Allahu Akbar, and it's not valid in being said in another language. Uh, in order to deal with that topic of the permissibility of the takbiratul ihram, in another language, then you have to move to another madhab pretty much, right? Or there's other techniques, whether it's the Shafi madhab or whether it's the Hanafi madhab. they have some flexibility in how they deal with this issue. But in the madhab of Malik, Allahu Akbar, it is the statement that opens up the salah, and the only statement that is acceptable for that practice. The takbir, the first takbir, is necessary, and it is the takbir which forbids you from anything else. And they say that the salam is a tahleel, meaning that it releases you. When you say assalamu alaikum at the end of the salah, it releases you from that takbir, so to speak, or that ruling, that everything that you do after takbirat ihram is to be occupied with some aspect of the salah. Nothing else is permitted within that time period. And that's important to kind of shift not only from the movements of the body, like meaning that there's movements of the body that should be performed that you should be focusing on in the salah, to shift between that and there's things that you should say to the heart, like that the heart should be focused also on the salah. To make it more simple, don't do anything other than what you should be doing in the salah, and make sure that your heart is attentive and conscious. And it's haram for you to do anything else, actually. Yeah, always keep that meaning in mind until it sets in, and it allows that salah to be what it is, a silla, a connection between you and Allah Ta'ala. The Quranic recitation of Quran. One of the things that I did not mention is that in the madhab of Malik, the basmala, or to say Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, we call that the basmala, is recited silently. In the madhab of Malik, there's a unique position that is not actually part of al-Fatiha, contrary to the other madhab. Uh, that's a unique position that is taken in the Maliki madhab, and is controversial position. Well, I don't want to get into that with a lot of depth right now, just because it's not the space for it, and that needs some background to talk about the whole idea of the basmala in the Quran, and uh, what constitutes the Fatiha, and so on and so forth. But in general, the release from that differing among the ulama, or what provides a strategy to not fall into the controversy, is just to recite it silently, right? Technically speaking, if you were to begin the salah with Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, uh, in terms of the recitation, and you were to miss out the Bismillah in this madhab of Malik, there's no issue with that. Uh, but in the other madhab, there is an issue, and that's fundamental. So again, if you were to say it silently and you're leading other people in the salah, then it's a way of considering the positions that they take and regarding their positions. And Madhab and Malik has that concept and the idea of muratul khilaf. You know, we just don't say that we should be united, but we can also go the extra step. And so we will consider the position that you're in, even though we don't agree with the evidence, right? So, um, so part of that is just being sensitive to the fact. Sometimes it creates an issue depending on the community that you're in, because the Bismillah, they start off the with it. And so if they don't hear it, they will question you on it. That's something to be mindful of, especially within Shafi environments. The Hanafis have a similar position to the Malikis in this regard. I forgot to mention that, but in any event, in this section, we're dealing with the Sunan, and sometimes I'm mentioning the Fard as well. Takbir al-Ihram is Fard. Every takbir after that is Sunnah. It doesn't mean that you leave it off, but if you were to forget, or if you miss it unconsciously, so to speak, there's no issue. The recitation of the Quran, in this case, in the section of Sunan, we're looking at making or we're looking at reciting a second surah after al-Fatiha, right, as being a sunnah. Now, there's a controversy in the madhab whether you have to recite a whole surah or not. And some people say minimum of three ayat of the Quran. Some say ayat is sufficient. Uh, all of that are scholarly debates, but there's evidences, even though in the madhab it may not be 100% supported, but there's evidences to show that, there is no minimal in that regard other than an ayah of the Quran. Like, I mean, there's no saying that it has to be three, it has to be a whole surah, you know, like you can get away with reciting an ayat, you can get away with reciting three ayat. That's important, especially for the new Muslim. That's important, especially for the Muslim that's working in on a tight schedule where they don't have much control of over, and they only have the ability to um they only have the ability to they only have the ability to pray within a certain limited time. So knowing that flexibility is important. Now, part of the confusion that came before was the issue of this section reciting the Fatiha prior to the Quranic chapters, and uh, meaning, and we have reorganized this reciting al Fatiha prior to it. Really, here you can say the second surah uh, is the Sunnah, meaning that al Fatiha should come before the recitation of anything else in the Quran. And so the thing came up here was that, okay, what about if you recite another surah prior to al-Fatiha? Well, it's a sunnah, to keep or maintain the order here. It doesn't necessarily, according to this, invalidate the salah, right? And standing up while you're reciting, it's a sunnah, right? And I don't want to go into all of the details of that. And then here, the rulings for reciting out loud or reciting silently. And so we mentioned that the minimum to recite out loud is that you can hear yourself, right? One of the things that is important, we started last time, we started this off and we talked about that the salah breaks up or is categorized into uh, three classes, or the first class being words, actions, or that which is neither of the two. A better classification, which is found in the madhab in other books, especially in the explanation of uh, Ashmawi, it's a text called El Jawahir Zakiya, or the purified jewels, and the Hashiyat of Safti, which I find it has standed the test of time as a text, even though it's Al Ashmawi is supposed to be a small text, but the explanation raises its rank in terms of its level, and also the type of knowledge that is in that book is not easily found in other books that are multi volumes or whatever. But the classification I think is better. Matters of the tongue, matters of the body, matters of the heart. And so instead of saying that which is neither of the two, we come back and we say, well, there's some things that are matters of the heart. Like for instance, the intention. And I like that classification because it falls in line with the hadith of Jibril as well. But in any event, uh, we kind of were looking at this and then we were classifying the actions of the salah according to this type of system, words, actions, so on and so forth. That's one of the things that we were doing. The reason why I bring that up is because when we talk about the salah and the recitation of the Quran within it, we're coming back to the issue of words. And so the silent recitation, can you just limit it to what is in the heart? And we said no. There has to be movement of the tongue in order for it to be considered recitation. But as far as the sound or as far as the emitting of speech, it should not be audible in order for it to be considered silent. But it shouldn't be just that you're running the surah in your mind, so to speak, right? Or just in your heart, right? The tongue should move. When you make the intention, which is broad, the intention is not mentioned here because the intention is from the wajibat, from the obligations. This section is only dealing with the Sunnan of the salah. When you make the intention doesn't belong on the tongue. Sometimes the scholars they will loosen up on this issue, but this is why I say some of these discussions on what constitutes bid'ah sometimes end up allowing for anything and everything. Not, I mean, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but in any event, the talaffuz bin niyyah or to enunciate the intention was not from the practices of the salah. That became something that was allowed later on in the fiqh, but in reality, it's considered an act of bid'ah, right? But some of the scholars they ease up on it, but the intention doesn't belong on the tongue. The intention belongs in the heart. Intention belongs on the heart, not on the tongue. That's a no go. The green is for go. Uh, the red is for no go. It's a no go. It shouldn't be done, right? And so we don't necessarily need to blast people for not performing it the way that it should be done. And that's how we get out of that, as we say, el afdal, right? What's better, what's best, what's more virtuous is to formulate the intention in the heart. And this is sticking with the practice of the sunnah. From the angle of education, a person may accustom themselves in the heart so that they, on point by talaffuz bin niyyah, but in reality, is not from the practices of the salah. The scholars got somewhat lax in that, and that's why they debate among themselves, with some of them just openly saying this is bid'ah. Right. And then they get in there and they get caught up into, okay, well, how do we make that work? Well, this is part of when we start talking about revival and reform. No, that practice is not a sound practice, even though it's in the books of fiqh, and you find there's debates across the madhab on it. And then you run into all kinds of issues like what happens when what you say for instance, if you want to pray Asr, or say you want to pray Dhuhr, and then you say 4 rakat Asr. So then now your words are contradicting what your intention is. Then you have to come up with a ruling for that. Okay, so is the salah sound? Is it not sound? That type of thing. No, from the beginning, the intention is in the heart. So focus on centering the heart. That becomes the key. Does that make sense or no?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, but I have one quick question pertaining to this. So sometimes you know how you like you ready to pray and you be like, oh Allah, you know what I mean, please accept my, is it and you be out loud with it. Is it still considered a
In
bitter?
in the madhab is not in the madhab it, it's okay, but yes, it's considered bid'ah, but is acceptable here. I personally don't. I think we should just be cautious on that issue. In the madhab, they don't make it issue. Sometimes they'll come out and say that, yeah, bid'ah. Other madhab, like in the Hanbali school, they definitely say, you find, especially later day scholars, it's bid'ah. In the madhab, a lot of times they usually say mahal niya al-qalb, that the mahal is the location, so to speak. Niya is the intention. Qalb is the heart. So the mahalun niya, or the location for the intention, where the intention is formed, in other words, is the heart. So that's the general statement in the school. Mahalun niya al qalb, not the tongue, because what's more important is the heart. The tongue is not always representative of what's in the heart. But if you say it in the madhab, is permissible.
So one more. So okay, so pretending back to the basmala, right? So sometimes I understand the part of not saying it out loud, right? But sometimes how sometimes you do start the prayer and you might say Bismillah, and and then you
No
remember all
issue.
this.
No, there's no issue.
Okay.
No issue in that. You know what I'm saying? خروج من الخلاف, مراعاة الخلاف, all of that type of stuff. That doesn't invalidate.
Now I got one more, and this is my last one. I ain't gonna ask one more. All right. We're turning back to the basmala. Does that still hold firm with let's say your wudu and ghusl? Is what I mean? You know how your touch is like Bismillah. Do you is it still in the heart or do we out?
That's especially best in the heart
Okay,
because you're in an area.
yeah, the bathroom. Yeah, okay, I got you. I got you. I see
Doesn't
this.
necessarily have to be the bathroom, but it may be an. I should say it may be an area where it's disliked to make dhikr, or it could be haram to make dhikr in the environment in a vocalized way. We lax on that because of the phones and stuff. And but part of retraining ourselves or reminding ourselves, a lot of stuff we know, but part of it is reorienting ourselves. There's people that are extremely strict on this stuff, so you would never catch them in the bathroom in an area where you defecate or wherever, and the Quran may come on, or they're reading something, or we become lax. There's no doubt about that in some cases. Um, so in the dhikra tanfa'ul mu'minin, the reminder benefits the believers. So indeed the reminder, or without doubt, benefits the believers. So those areas we have to practice sometimes, because sometimes we're attached to our phones, or sometimes we have as a ringer sound. Uh we're having a nasheed and it's mentioning Allah's name, or we're having ayah of the Quran. Like, people do different things in that regard. Or sometimes, we go into the bathroom and we're students of the Quran, and we're still, our tongue is still moving with the Quran and stuff. So it's best in those environments. So even when it comes to the issue of the wudu and the basmala, it falls under that category. And it being in the heart, inshallah, increases the reward from the angle of ta'zeem, from the angle of glorifying and honoring the name of Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala, and also from the angle of, abiding uh by by the sunnah in that regard. You know what I'm saying? A lot of times these practices are there for educational reasons to facilitate the transference of the reality, meaning that you may start off because there's debates about dhikr, right, among the scholars. Is the dhikr that is made without presence of the heart worthy and valid? So, one of the most pedagogical, meaning educationally oriented positions, is that don't chastise the people, say, for instance, if they have dhikr beads and they're just making dhikr and it's formal with the tongue without it being in the heart. Because after some time, the realization of what is on their tongues in terms of what it is that they're saying can come into the heart. So that's all an educational reality. You see what I'm saying? That's not a, that's just talking about how do you get people to be better Muslims? How do you get people to be in a better spiritual state? So there's some things that are allowed from the angle of ta'lim and tarbiyah that are not necessarily what the fiqh is, right? Ta'lim and tarbiyah means education and formation, education and shaping the individual, guiding the individual into practice. So out loud dhikr together in a group from the angle of ta'lim and tarbiyah is acceptable. But from the angle of fiqh, it could be debated on what is bid'ah or is not bid'ah. So when you're teaching people, whether adults or other than adults, because we don't separate in terms of knowledge by age. We look at ability to understand and so on and so forth, and what a person's level is in understanding. And so you can have youth and you can have adults. They don't know the askar. The askar in this case are those dhikrs or the addiya. Askar is plural of dhikr. Addiya is plural of dua that are made with the salah after the salah. And so it may be the case that part of the training process of getting people to be familiarized, conscious, and well grounded in these practices, that this stuff is done out loud. The Sufis, they take that as kind of, they shift sometimes from acknowledging that it is a training to just making it almost like an act of worship. And that's erroneous. That's an erroneous approach because it confuses the people to know what, like when we're talking about fiqh, one of the things that we talked about earlier, we started off in the other session, is this idea of holding everything to be at the same level in terms of having to practice it. So when you don't clarify that these are educational techniques, yes, they may not have been there exactly the same at the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but they're educational techniques. But you don't clarify between the educational technique and the actual practice of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, either in terms of guidance that we get from the Sunnah or uh, what he actually did. Then you create confusion, and those things are debated. You know what I'm saying? They're debatable points. So, in terms of what to practice, so when you get have a situation that a practice is debated among the ulama, even to the level of being labeled as a bid'ah, then the pathway is attempting to resolve the controversy, not just leaving it like that. And so part of resolving the controversy in a very facile, easy way is to categorize the thing under education, not under, an act of worship. not as an act of worship. Because the act of worship is modeled and patterned after the prophetic model and pattern. So then you have to run into justifying why is it that you're doing something that was not done by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And that's part of the dilemma and some of the way that the fiqh is dealt with. The solution is there from the angle of this is educational, even if it's like 1,000 times that you do. They're doing it so that they're trained, so that this is part of their training, right? They're not doing it because it's part of the salah. So some of these issues like talaffuz bin niyyah, they come into the fiqh and then it's not clarified. And then what happens is that like talaffuz bin niyyah is the vocalization of the intention. So sometimes they come in and then there's controversy around it. And some of the scholars consider it permissible. Some of the scholars say it's bid'ah. Some of them don't say anything because they don't look at it as a negative bid'ah. And because their judgment of what bid'ah is, they classify bid'ah into different categories. And others say, heck no. They say this is a bid'ah, is a deviation from how it was done. And we're not going into the classification of bid'ah into being uh obligatory or non-obligatory or recommended or haram. We're looking at bid'ah is either sunnah or bid'ah. There's two schools of bid'ah, and I don't want to get into that right now. But so what happens is that when we teach the fiqh, when people don't have that background, they don't have the ability to discuss that issue, right? And that's a to go into it with a lot of depth is a number of lessons and conversations that are really not for this level. But the background of that should be pointed out. You know what I'm saying? It should be pointed out so that people are not confused. So that's why I say it's in the books of fiqh. It's not necessarily the optimal practice according to the sunnah itself and according to the madhab, but it's allowable. Kind of, it's allowable, and that's it. And that's why they say it afdal. And I like the way that the madhab deals with that. But it is a point of controversy to the point of people, scholars, saying that it's bid'ah as I mentioned. But that extends to other things as well, the conversation, And so part of how that a lot of that stuff can be handled in those versus it just being I can't do it, I cannot do it. It's like the same thing with the Mawlid. The Mawlid is by no means part of the Sunnah, right? But the occasion of the Mawlid and gathering people to the masjid and like yesterday I went to an event like that. You know what I'm saying? But there was no, you don't have like necessarily like the whole issue of we're making 1,000 salawat or 100 salawat and we're doing this poetry and we're doing that and this that whatever. And to the point where it is kind of like a celebration of the Prophet's birthday. Alayhi salatu wasalam. It becomes more of an educational event. So, there was a discussion on what the Prophet means in our lives and how it is that uh we are going to revitalize the ummah from the prophetic example. Right. So that's a little more on the light side, in terms of what to do during those types of events. But those are controversial issues that, is like how do you deal with it? Well, a lot of times you can get away with some of these things without falling into controversy. Say it's an educational experience. But the fight comes when people try to make it part of deen. When you say it's an educational experience, some people may agree with it, some people may not, but it's not that easy to argue against something when you're saying this is not part of deen, is an educational experience. We're teaching people the importance of seerah, and we're using this opportunity on a regular basis to do it. That's a controversy, but it's less controversial than saying it's part of deen. There's the Muslims that don't want to. There's sometimes the scholars themselves, may Allah bless them, that don't always want to use the tools of scholarship to get out of some of these problems that we confront in knowledge. And it's my duty to say, from the angle as being an educator, I'm not going to claim to be a scholar, but as angled as an educator, that when we study, we have to be mindful of these types of subtleties so that we can navigate our religious experience and it's just not plagued by controversy. Because the principle does say, and I remind myself and you all of this reality, the principle says that the matters of the heart weigh heavier than other matters when it comes to action. Uh, that doesn't mean we leave out action, but what it means is that we have to look at the condition of our heart, the state of our heart. And so when we do an action, the state of our heart is important. It's not just getting caught up in the formality of the action, which form is important, right? Because without form, we run into everybody making up their own religion. So we're fighting over how to do it, but also what we're missing the point on is the state of our heart. You know what I'm saying? And so that we need to be outside of the realm of controversy and conflict and confusion so that we can be tranquil in our space of worship so that we can focus on our own development. And I hate to say this because I come from another religion and I have experience with other religions. But I hate to say it is like we've turned our religion into a point of controversy. And Malik talked about that, people making their deen a target. Every time some new idea comes, they switch, they change, they this, that. That's not good. And that's what's happening in today's time. Now everybody jumps on the whole following the madhab thing. And so it becomes something more popular to do. Following the madhab concept or studying madhab is an ancient concept. Doesn't have to be turned into a trend. The same thing. Well, okay, we said Molid was bid'ah before. Now we're saying it's not bid'ah. So then it becomes a trend. No, no. Constant switching in your practices on a regular basis, that doesn't mean don't grow, right? But one minute you're jumping on this, next minute you're jumping on that. That's not good. It's different than migrating to a practice because you studied, you understand, and you're migrating to that practice. But so we, in any event, we have to be in the position where we can guide people, guide ourselves, guide people, because we're all we have. So we shouldn't create an environment where the heart is not at ease. And the point that I was trying to make is that coming from another faith, another religion, like when I was a Catholic, the church is a place of worship in the limited sense of it's just between you and God. Because worship in Islam is not just between you and God, there's a social aspect to it. Um, but the church is a place of quiet, a place of tranquility, a place internally where there's non-conflict, is a place where you go and you explore your heart and your relationship with God, so to speak. And the masjid should be that. But the masjid becomes a place where this person's correcting you about your hijab. The other one's telling you about moving your finger in salah. The other one is telling you where you should put your hands. The other one is arguing with you about your feet. The other one is arguing about the adhans. That is a sign of fitna in the most clearest sense. So when we learn fiqh, we're not learning fiqh so that we cancel out over here or that we also push practices, which is, good scholarship knows where the conflict is at and the differences of opinion are at and informs how to navigate those differences of opinion, right? That's what we call fiqh in the real sense, understanding. So something like vocalizing on the tongue is a point of controversy, not as much as other practices, but it's a point of controversy. And so, does that mean that we ignore the fact that some scholars have said that it's permissible? No. But how do you reconcile that? And so, part of how do you reconcile that is saying, well, from an angle of education, like I mentioned, there's no issue with that. As far as the angle from the angle of education, meaning you're training yourself, or also you're teaching someone, but the angle you're teaching someone how to implement the reality of the salah. But the from the angle of worship, no, doesn't belong there because it's not what was practiced. And that's under the rule of al-ibadah tawqifiyya, tawqifiyya, al-ibadah tawqifiyya. And so the idea is that worship, it is as it is. It's transmitted to us. It's not a creative affair. Sallu kama ra'aytumuni usalli. Right? And so the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, pray the salah or model the salah after what I have modeled for you, after what you have seen that I have modeled for you. So we try to implement that as much as possible, even though we have varying opinions. Those opinions have to be grounded in prophetic practice. They can't just be speculation. So when we look at what is consistent in practice, that's not a consistent practice. But the scholars later on, they have their reasons why it is at times that they, present these ideas as being acceptable, and that's where that comes from. In the madhab, is both are acknowledged, but that's why the madhab say it's better to leave it off, but they give some room for it to be done. And it's not to make anybody feel bad about it or anything like that, but that's just the reality, of how that works. But, and so going back to okay, so we talked about the minimal for what constitutes recitation, which is that you hear it yourself. And we talked about what's necessary in the silent recitation, and that's the movement of the tongue. And so saying Sami Allahu liman hamida, right? Uh is a sunnah. Sami, Sami, it basically means that Allah hears. Sami Allah. Allah hears. The one who laudates or praises, glorifies, says the Alhamd. That's a reminder that our ibadah, our worship has efficacy, that our deeds, al-amal al-salihat, they have value. with Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, right? And there's reward in saying that. There's um there's reward in saying that. Uh, but if you miss it, it's from the Sunnah. Prostration, we mentioned in the obligation that the minimum obligatory prostration is the prostration on the forefront of the head. Even though it's not from the deen, it's kind of a ta'wilat, or ta'wilat is kind of like interpolation or interpretation or adding on to it. Like Mikhail Smith said something that was interesting with regard to the prostration in Nasia. Nasia is the foremost part of the head. And he made a point that this is wherein, in this part of the brain, in the cerebral cortex area of the brain, where decisions are made. Again, it's just for interesting reflection, even though there's no direct evidence on it, because that's not necessarily the meaning that we find in the deen. The face, what we find in the deen is that the face is the most honored portion of the human being. And it is an indication of the self. And I didn't mention the position of the idea that Mullah Mikhail Smith said, but in the deen, the face is associated with that, with the self, and is the most honored portion of the human being. And the human being standing upright is also a sign of Allah honoring the human being. Like we're not crawling on the ground, and so we're standing upright and so on and so forth. And so the face also is a marker of the person. Your face may not be like my faces. Faces are unique. And so the forehead is we're taking the most honored part of ourselves and we're placing that before Allah in subservience and submittance and resigning our affairs to Allah. May Allah grant us all those realities. But interestingly enough, Moran Mikhail Smith, he was saying that you're taking the part where your decision making is done in the brain, so to speak, and you're submitting that to God. And he made the argument that we're tempted to construct an argument from that the decision making that one has is making in one's life one is surrendering it to God. It's a nice point of reflection. So the prostration on the forehead is what's obligatory. Now, including the nose in that, which this is important, especially when the winter comes and when people get sick and so on and so forth. And you know, what do you do? What do you prostrate on when you have headaches and you're trying to go into sujood? You attempt, to keep to that minimal obligation. Sometimes some of these rugs they trigger the allergies and all that type of stuff. But and during COVID especially was but and then in any event, including the nose in that prostration is a sunnah. But the fundamental aspect of the prostration is the prostrating on the head. Prostrating on the two palms is a
So
sunnah.
the head is obligatory, the forehead is obligatory, but not the nose. The nose is
Right,
sunnah.
right, because
Okay.
this section is the
Exactly.
sunnah section. Yeah, we're just
Okay.
kind of reviewing both a little bit.
Yeah.
And so the making the prostration upon the two palms is a sunnah, and including the tips of the feet is a sunnah. Sometimes this we're laxed in this. Just like in the tawarruk, where we put one foot under the other foot, there's a lot of laxity in that aspect or that part of the form of the salah. But in these areas, there's some flexibility, but it doesn't mean that you know, again, sometimes I try to mention some of the positives of the Salafi da'wah just to eliminate the conflict zone, right? Not necessarily that one submits and agrees with everything, but one of the points that they did really well was they made everybody conform to a certain set of posturing in the salah, whether it was um very clearly distinct movements in the salah, so that each movement is very pronounced and is very notable, or whether it was using your knuckles to come up. They didn't invent that. Their stuff that's rooted in the evidences. But the reason why I say that is because the tawaruk, and I've seen elders that have knowledge of the salat mention this in the community, because a lot of people, when they, aside from whether what your physical condition is, because when your physical condition is down, there's exceptions to the rule and all this. But if you're able, you know, bodily able, so to speak, to make some of these moves, and you leave them out, and so it's a problem. So we should get to the point where we can properly pray Salah and perfect it, right? And so sometimes, in this case, I was using the tawarruk, where you put one foot under another foot as an example. But in our case here in the book, the tips of the feet, you know, where the tips of the feet, where you're properly, making prostration on them. The same thing with the palms. And then when you get into the makruhat, or those things which I dislike, you see the fact that people, they either put their arms really wide out, or they put their arms so close to themselves. You know what I'm saying? Like, these are things which take away. We have to realize we have a deen where we know who our prophet is from birth to death. We're not talking about a leader who is invisible to us, or is a leader which half of that person's life is imagination. That's why it's important to know the historical reality of who the prophet is. Alayhi salatu wasalam. The other thing is that he left us an example. No ummah can make that claim. And having it actually documented in detail, you're not going to find any prophet or even any leader which someone knows all these details about that person. So when it comes to worship in Islam, it's not a guess. When it comes to this limited concept of worship, we're dealing with the rukn of the salah. Worship in Islam, like we mentioned, is anything that is done or said that pleases Allah with the right intention, that doesn't go against the sunnah. But more specifically, when we talk about ibadah in the case of salah, there's rules to the game. More respectfully said, there's rules to the act of worship. It's not it's not a guessing thing. That's extremely important. And so all of these things are there so that the next generation is very clear on their deen, and they're not making stuff up and falling into superstition or imagination or disputation to the point where it becomes a conflict and the original teachings are lost. So part of preserving the original teachings here, because we're saying that Salah is the pathway to connect to Allah wa ta'ala, and act that is pleasing to Allah. We're not guessing on what is pleasing to Allah. So these things come in to preserve. The tashahhud and the salam. We talked about this before, and I wanted to bring this up here. Here it goes right here. It's in the Fadila. No, hold on a second. Okay, so here we mentioned this before as well. This has to be done too. The organization of this section a little better. Uh, the making of supplication in the second tashahhud. And this is literally dua in the after the tashahhud. And that would make the second tashahhud longer by default from the first one because there's a dua that is being made. And I have to pull it up. What is the dua in the so uh is clear for people. But supplicating in general after the tashahhud for your needs or for whatever it may be, there's no harm in that. But especially here is mentioned, where is it at? Here. This is extremely important and it's missing. The supplication and the time of prostration. Supplication and the time of prostration. That's something, this is from the Fadila. This section is the Fadila, but it's something that is what is not oftentimes talked about, right? And now we're getting into what? We're getting into the whole idea of dua al-mustajaba, the dua or the supplication that is accepted, that's heard and is accepted. Um, People oftentimes they ask, well, about that, like, how can I have a prayer that a dua that's accepted? Well, part of it is also knowing when and where dua is made. And these two areas, the prostration and the section of the tashahhud, uh, which is the second part, the second tashahhud after the tashahhud is made, are two areas which are not really talked about much. You know what I'm saying? Which is important to talk about it. And I want to end on that note for today, inshallah. والعصر إن الإنسان في خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. Okay, inshallah, until next time. Assalamu alaikum.
Jazakallah khair, Sheikh Yusuf.
Allah yakramik.